Hello everyone, thank you for coming. It's a nice crowd and this is meant to be a fairly informal affair, so I do need to refer to my notes quite a bit because there's quite a bit of information, so please excuse me if I'm rustling through notes here and there, but I'll try and do as much off the cuff as I possibly can. So I'd also like to pay my respects to the Wadawurrung people, the first inhabitants of the land that I'm presenting on tonight. I can't see a thing with my glasses on. Long range, so I'll have to take them on and off. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of organisations in Ballarat. As Anthony said, this talk is based on a master's research project that I did in 2022, and without the generous and very cheerful support of a number of organisations, I wouldn't have been anywhere near as able to gather as much information as I did. So the Eureka Centre was extremely helpful, particularly Simon Jacks, who I believe has just recently retired. The Ballarat Mechanics Institute, the Art Gallery of Ballarat, Robin Hovey at the Art Gallery was wonderful. The Ballarat Health, and I'll explain why I'm talking about Ballarat Health later. Ballarat Cemeteries, and I don't think I've forgotten anyone. Hopefully I haven't. And what was the Sovereign Hill Gold Museum at the time. It now has a new name, the Australian Centre. Thank you. Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ballarat Punch in context, because Ballarat Punch forms one of many, many punches that were produced in the 19th century across the globe that followed the contours of the British Empire. I'll then talk about some of the contributors to the 1857 Ballarat Punch and the 1860s run, and then I'll talk about the content and some of the interesting things I found in the content. And what I'm presenting tonight is only one small... Are you signalling to me, Anthony? Oh, one small facet of what I found. There were so many other things that were interesting in the Ballarat Punch, so I believe there's going to be an effort to digitise them at some point, so that would be wonderful for people to access them and read them, because this is your punch. Any town across the British Empire that had a pretense to culture, as Joan Kerr once said, had to have its own punch. So Ballarat had one. So, as Anthony said, there was a brief run in 1857 and then a later run in the 1860s, and I'll just provide a brief overview of some of the content. So this first slide is the cover page of the inaugural edition in the 1860s in February 1867. So I need to put the Ballarat Punch in context. Ballarat Punch modelled itself very much on a magazine that was called Punch, or the London Charivari, which in turn was named after a satirical magazine called the French Charivari. And it was very much a satirical magazine. There was an explosion of satirical periodicals in the 19th century, and they really were the Facebook and the TikTok and the Snapchat and whatever else people use these days. They were where people got their gossip, their news, their humour, and satire was, and still is, a very important way of discussing events of the day, but also how people feel or felt about the events of the day. There's as much emotion infused in satire and satirical historical periodicals as there is content. So they're very important historical documents, and Punch in general has been a very under-researched magazine outside of the London Punch. So the London Punch ran from 1841 to 1992, and then it ran again from 1996 until 2002. And the latter editions were run by Muhammad Al-Fayed. He purchased the rights. And I think it's quite ironic that he probably was trying to get some social capital and be accepted by the British establishment. And it's ironic that he picked the Punch to do that, because you couldn't get a more snobby, white, middle-class periodical than the London Punch in the 19th century. And I think everyone probably knows he didn't really succeed before he passed away. So this slide here was produced by my now PhD supervisor, Professor Richard Scully, and he knocked this up about 12 or 13 years ago. So he's been extolling the virtues of satire as an important historical source for a long time, and people are now starting to listen. So the pink bits on the map are the reach of the British Empire, And little dots and all the writing across the map are all the various punches, and not all of the punches that were produced in the 19th century are included in this map. There were, to date, about 70 punches produced in India. But some of the punches produced across the British Empire were very much about reinforcing British superiority. Some of the punches were very much about pushing back on imperial expansion. So, for example, the Punch in Cairo was very much an anti-imperial magazine, and they used the British satirical model to push back. The London Punch was the model satirical publication across the globe. So even though different publications across the globe used the Punch branding, they didn't necessarily replicate the content. Most content was about local issues. It was also a way of expressing identity. So many British publications across the globe were very much about enforcing British superiority, and many were about repelling it, as I said. So I have I'm very excited. I have a thing, which is, I've never had one of those before. So this here is, as I said, the inaugural cover of the Ballarat Punch, and I'm going to fast forward a bit. So here we have all the Australian punches. There was, first and foremost, initially a Melbourne Punch produced, and that was very much a British periodical and reinforced Britishness. And the Bulletin is usually upheld as the premier Australian publication that talked about nationalism, and not much has really been said about the Melbourne Punch, apart from a few scholarly journal articles. But while the Bulletin was enforcing Australian national sentiment, the Punch was trying to do the opposite. It was really interesting. We had an Adelaide Punch very briefly, and obviously the Ballarat Punch. There were 6 Tasmanian punches produced, a Sydney Punch that was never really as successful as the Melbourne one, and a long run of Queensland punches with it ended up becoming the Queensland Punch and Figaro. And there's also an Ipswich Punch, which I'm going to get my hands on in about 6 months' time. And there were 8 New Zealand punches produced, and I'll be looking at those as part of my doctorate as well. No one's ever looked at the New Zealand punches. No one's ever really looked at most of the Australian punches, so they're ripe for the picking. Sorry. So this cover here, just to give you a flavour of the different kind of punches, this is a cover page on one of the London punches, and this is a very famous cover page produced by an English cartoonist, Richard Doyle. And this started publication, I believe, in 1849 as the cover page of Punch, and went through until 1954. This one here is the Melbourne Punch. I should know that. The Sydney Punch, one of the Tasmanian punches, and one of the Indian punches, I think. No, it's the Adelaide Punch, sorry. It's an Australian punch. So I told you I couldn't see very much without my glasses on. So here we have Punch in Canada with a maple leaf, and you can see the local iconography there. Cape Punch in South Africa. No one's ever looked at the Cape Punch in South Africa. Can you imagine the interesting content in there? One of the Indian punches, the Avad Punch, and the Japan Punch. The Japan Punch was actually produced by an Englishman called Charles Workman, who really just produced it for the local expats because they were quite homesick, but it was very much about British superiority. There was a later Japanese publication that was very much about Japanese nationalism. So again, these magazines can tell you so much about identity, but much more than the newspapers, because they're infused with so much emotion. Okay, so I'll talk briefly about the 1857 run. So there was a lot of anticipation and excitement in Ballarat at the time when the 1857 run was produced. There were lots of newspaper articles I could find that talked about that. But William Bramwell Withers, I'm sure some of you know who he is. He produced a history of Ballarat in 1880 and then a second edition again in 1887. And the 1887 edition was where he mentioned the people who were involved in the Ballarat Punch, the 1857 edition. So he talked about Henry Harris, who was a local businessman, and Henry Harris wrote to the Ballarat Star and vigorously denied any involvement, and I could never get to the bottom of what was going on there. Frank Haslam was a Melbourne journalist, and he was actually at the Eureka Stockade, and he was reporting on the Eureka Stockade as it was unfolding, and he was shot by a stray bullet. And I found an article that had him back in England in 1861, and he passed away, I think, in 1862 due to complications from his bullet wounds. Edward Charles Moore, he came across to Australia in 1854. He was quite an established artist, and he also got into mining, the mining industry, the big mining industry in shares, and he was a racing personality as well. And he moved to Melbourne eventually, and he got into terrible trouble. He had a terrible gambling addiction, got into significant debt, was stealing money from the Racing Commission in Victoria, and his wife found him one morning. He'd been drinking quite a bit of alcohol, and then he shot himself, and she found him in the morning. So that was very sad. And the other two men that were cited by Withers were Francis Wilson Niven and Charles Augustus Abbott, and I will talk about them in a little bit more detail. So I need to read a fair bit to you tonight. So the artist Herbert Woodhouse, who wrote a book called The Victorian Pioneers of Litho Drawing and Engraving in Melbourne in 1889, said, and I quote, "In about 1855, Mr. F.W. Niven, having as his studio a tent, that being quite the thing in residence at Ballarat during the 50s, that is the 1850s, he worked on a small hand press first put to use in August 57 for the production of Ballarat Punch, the outside cover of which was drawn by the late E.C. Moore. The cover of this comic journal is in Mr. Niven's possession." Withers noted in his history, referring to the 1857 Punch, and I quote, "Mr. C.E. Moore designed a capital title page for it that never appeared for want of the necessary wood or stone engravers." So as part of my research, I found some possessions in two boxes that are held at the Melbourne University archives, and I found this in there. Now, this is a sketch that was drawn in December 1856, and it was obviously meant to be the cover of the 1857 Ballarat Punch, and it was drawn directly from Richard Doyle's famous cover. You can see he's traced it basically. And so Mr. Punch, I should have said earlier, the Punch magazine was named after the old theatre puppet Mr. Punch and Judy shows, which had been around in England as street theatre since the 1600s. And it was a very, very clever marketing point because he was a much-loved character, and the London people just ate it up as a brand. And so what you can see here is lots of stereotypically drawn industrious Chinese people running around doing their mining. You've got tents, you've got a horse-drawn puddling machine, so it's very much representative of the alluvial goldfields in the 1850s. And you've got people scrambling for the pile of gold. So I'll speak very briefly about Francis Niven. He's very important in the history of printing in Ballarat and Victoria and Australia. So he was an Irish immigrant, and he came out here with his wife Elizabeth in 1854 and subsequently produced 8 children and one of the most successful and prolific printing companies in Ballarat, if not the state. He was also a bit of a braggart. So he published a series of reminiscences in 1898, I think it was, and there were 4 different editions in the Ballarat Star. And he talked about being on the goldfields with all these goldfield luminaries like Peter Laylaw and O'Connor and all these big stars, King Billy. And he also talked about thwarting a mutiny on the ship named the Anna that he came out on from Liverpool. But when I actually went through his little box of things, it was much more evident that when he came to Australia in 1854, he had been a seaman prior to that, and he had been in Victoria in 1852, but he came out as part of his maritime duty. So I'm pretty confident that his employers wouldn't have let him run amok on the goldfields for a significant period of time. So I think he was a bit of exaggeration there. Having said that, he single-handedly taught himself with no training whatsoever. He bought an old second-hand machine from a fellow called Mr. Ronalds, who in turn had bought it out from the Staffordshire property, and he taught himself everything he knew in a tent. And he was an amazing man, amazing businessman and an amazing printer. So in the latter decades of the 19th century, he collaborated with Henry Crisp in the application of the Crisp photo process. And in 1894, F.W. Niven & Co., which was his company, produced Victoria and its Resources, which had a range of coloured maps and photographs. 2,000 copies were purchased by the Victorian government and subsequently shipped to the UK as part of their marketing ploy to get the British to come out to the colonies, and signed copies were handed to Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. So he was a fairly prolific and well-known fellow. So with that in mind, I think that his significance in the history of printing in Victoria, I think it's lovely that the humble little 1857 run of the Ballarat Punch was what kick-started his very stellar career. So good on you, Punch. He relocated to Melbourne in 1901 and died 4 years later. Can everyone hear me okay? So now I'm going to talk about the real star of the show, Charles Augustus Abbott. So Charles Abbott was an English immigrant. He came here in 1852. I don't have any record of his activities from 1852 until 1866, but I suspect he came to try his luck on the goldfields. He never married, and he began a punching career in 1866. So he was associated with the 1857 run, but apart from Wither's commentary in his history book, I couldn't find any evidence expanding on that. But in 1866, John Kirkland Baird, who later became Mayor of East Ballarat, I think in 1872, at the time in 1866 owned an art gallery, and he had an exhibition, and there were all sorts of wonderful exhibits from famous masters and all sorts of famous people. And Charles Abbott also exhibited some sketches, some Punchian-like caricature, and he received rave reviews. So I'll read those reviews out to you from the Ballarat Star. In amongst choice paintings and sculpture, as well as reproductions of paintings in chromolithograph and coloured photographs of pictures by eminent masters, was a folio volume of pen and ink sketches a la Punch from the hand of Mr. Abbott, an artist of much merit and caricature as a caricaturist. He has cleverly hit off some of our notabilities and local peculiarities. We have no doubt that the numerous loungers in Mr. Baird's gallery will find Ballarat Punch not one of the least attractions in time to come. Later on it said, Mr. Abbott's volume of Ballarat Punch is alone worth the price of admission. So he was making a name for himself and clearly had aspirations to set up a new Punch in 1866. In the register of publications from the 19th century, I found that F.W. Niven and Baird had been the sureties for his venture setting up the 1867 Punch. So they were obviously very impressed with him at the gallery. What I also found was Charles Abbott was the great nephew of a Lord Chief Justice of the King's Bench who served as Chief Justice from 1818 to 1832, and he was an elder Charles Abbott. He was also known as Charles Abbott. And he later served in the House of Lords with the newly bestowed title of First Baron Tenterton of Hendon in the county of Middlesex. So the elder Charles Abbott, and I love this, I loved it when I found it, in 1786 he won the Oxford University Essay Prize, English Essay Prize, as a 25-year-old Oxford scholar for an essay titled, wait for it, On the Use and Abuse of Satire. Isn't that delicious? And his essay concluded, the benefits derived from satire are far superior to the disadvantages, and its authors may therefore be deservedly numbered amongst the happiest instructors of mankind. So Lord Tenterton died in 1832, so he never got to see the nascence of Punch, the phenomenon of Punch, or I think Charles Abbott the younger would have been about 3 at the time he passed away, so he never got to see his great-nephew's exploits in Ballarat either, which is really sad, because he clearly thought satire was the thing. Okay. I'll just say a little bit more about Charlie Abbott before I move on to content. I couldn't find much about him, so I established that he was the sole editor and cartoonist for the latter edition of the Ballarat Punch in the 1860s. But there are a couple of newspaper articles talking about his death and the fact that he'd passed away after suffering what I've established now as rheumatoid arthritis. But because he'd been unwell, I thought, I wonder if the hospital has any medical records on file. And what I found out was the Eureka Centre have hospital records going back to the 1850s on microfiche, which Simon dug out for me. And I also applied under Freedom of Information and got the original handwritten admission and discharged entries for his 14 hospital admissions. So I was able to get a lot of information that way about when he came into the country, his marital status, his age, his date of birth, and then I was able to cross-reference that with information on ancestry because you don't know how many Charles Abbots came out here on the goldfields in the 1850s. So without that microfiche medical record, I would never have found any of this stuff out. So it's fascinating. I think so anyway. So I'll move on to content now. So like any satirical magazine, and particularly Punch, they held human folly, vice and other human failings to account. And so this sketch is by Charles Abbott, is Mr. Punch admonishing Emmanuel Steinfeld, who was the mayor of East Ballarat in the late 1860s. And the caption reads, don't know if you can read it. Oh, you can? Steinfeld, my boy, you really must prevent a recurrence of this if you can. So Punch was often used as a spokesperson for holding crooked politicians to account. Like any Punch across the globe, women were portrayed in decorative and domestic roles, and so much was made about their costumes and their fashions and their hairstyles. And the one on the left, there was a lot made about women in the 19th century wearing, I think I'm saying this correctly, chignons. I don't speak French. Chignon? Yep, that'll do. And back then, there are the natural chignons that women with long hair had, but a lot of women had these fake hair balls on top of their head to make out like they had lots more hair than they did. And I looked up some London literature as well, and there was much made about it in London periodicals at the time. And there was a lot of anger. Men would write about women using false advertising. And now on the right-hand side, where's my clicker? The one on the right, and this was also done by Charles Abbott, this is portraying a fashion craze that came out of New York, a walking craze called the Grecian Bend. So women would walk around like this in America. Can you imagine the state of their spine? And Charlie Abbott said, I can't quite make out that writing, but I know what he said. And he said, if this fashion craze comes to Australia, I shall deem to call it the Yarra Bend. Now, Charles Abbott went for the jugular with crooked politicians. And this one on the left is one of my favourite political cartoons. So it takes sometimes 2 or 3 days to unpack these cartoons. You have to go through all the newspaper archives. But when I got it, it was funny. So this little fella here is representative of Charles Dyke, the politician. He was a politician in the 1860s in Ballarat. And I didn't realise how many streets in Ballarat are named after the mayors at the time. So Charles Dyke has a bill for £350 in his beak, and he's sitting on a branch called Spargoism, and he's wearing multiple hats. So I'll break that down for you, and I'll talk about the bottom bit in a minute. So Charles Dyke was also a mining agent and an MP. Now, MPs weren't paid back in those days, so they were quite open to bribery. And so he facilitated a land lease deal for the St Andrews Mining Company and was paid by an intermediary titled named Mr Spargo. And so Spargoism became prevalent in the lexicon in Victoria after that. So it was used to denote taking bribes to facilitate mining leases at the time. So the multiple hats are representative of Dyke's multiple interests, and he must have been a particularly naughty boy right through the publication of the Ballarat Punch, because he was constantly drawn with multiple hats, and on one occasion he was wearing 12. So he must have been a particularly naughty boy that day. Now, I find this interesting too. So he's got, this is various news agencies shooting him down. So we've got the Argus, the Age, the Herald, the Ballarat Star, the Melbourne Punch, and the Ballarat Punch. Now, it's interesting that he places himself with the Melbourne publications. He didn't really get on with many of the publishers here, except the Ballarat Star. And if you think back to the praise that the Ballarat Star heaped on him when he first presented his work at Baird's Art Gallery, that probably makes sense. This one here is Presbyterian minister turned MP and newspaper editor David Blair, and I'll talk about him before I talk about the cartoon. So he was a Scottish Presbyterian minister, and he came under sustained attack from the Ballarat Punch for religious zealotry. So he was born in Ireland to Scottish parents, and Abbott often referred to him as Davy, and he satirised him mercilessly through the pages of the Ballarat Punch for the whole run. And he also served as in the Legislative Assembly for Talbot and Crowlands, and worked as a journalist for the Argus and the Age before assuming the position of editor for the Ballarat Evening Post. So only weeks after the reappearance of Ballarat Punch in 1867, Abbott put Blair under fire for his views on Darwin's theory of evolution. So while in Melbourne the debates about Darwinism were being had amongst academics, in Ballarat they were being held between the press and the public. And so Davey had a few things to say about what he thought were Darwin's ridiculous views. And Abbott wrote, and I quote, "Of Blair and his views on Darwinism, Blair says it is wrong. How does Blair know? Is it not presumptuous in a professing Christian to say that he knows how anything occurred or that any theory is opposed to Scripture? While Mr. Punch's beliefs are one with creation, we are not averse to open inquiry or fair disputation." Sorry about my stuttering tonight. So when Blair took on the role of editor as editor of the Evening Post in 1867, which historian Weston Bate described as a sensationalist rag, the Ballarat Punch marked the occasion with this cartoon. So we have Blair sitting in Coward's Castle. Does anyone not know what Coward's Castle refers to? It's parliamentary privilege for parliamentarians to basically say whatever they like about whoever they like with absolutely no repercussions. So he's put him in the parliamentary Coward's Castle, built of envy, hatred, malice, and all uncharitableness. And he's turned public opinion, so the words public opinion are upside down, turning public opinion upside down with hypocrisy, smoke, falsehoods, and I can't read that one. And Mr. Punch is in the background, keeping an evil eye on him. And he's got little Joey with him, and I'll talk about little Joey in a minute. Aren't they fantastic cartoons? They say so much, don't they? Okay, like any Punch, like any satirical magazine in the 19th century, there was a lot of racism. The Indigenous population in Ballarat actually weren't vilified too much, and I think that's not because there was any empathy for them, but because they just weren't seen as important or significant or a threat. So there were very few cartoons about them, and when they were referenced in the Punch, it was often in relation to references to dog eating or cannibalism. But this cartoon here is about two Aboriginal folk being astonished at how a white man can get water out of the ground. And I think it speaks to the ignorance of the Ballarat population then in terms of the Aboriginals' relationship to water and land and the elements. So that was one of the tamer ones. The Chinese were also vilified. Now this one here represents a Chinaman extolling the virtues of being in prison. So he's saying, this is very good being in jail, you don't have to work and you get free food. This one here is obviously a wealthy white man trying to evict a Chinaman from a first-class carriage. And as you can see, he's literally digging his heels in and he's saying, no, you go find somewhere else to sit. So you can see a little bit of empathy in there. And Abbott, there was a very big mixture of reflecting the views of the day, but also infusing some empathy. And I think what he was reflecting was there were different views in any community. Not everyone was a racist, not everyone was anti-Chinese. And I think any good periodical reflects those diverse views. So that's the value of some of these publications as well. When you read them, do a careful reading of all the text and decode the cartoons, there's a myriad of messages in them. He also lampooned the Irish. So this cartoon was drawn in September 1867 in preparation for the visit of Prince Alfred, the Duke of Edinburgh, who was Queen Victoria's son. And he came out in December 1867 to great fanfare and British flag waving, and everyone, yay! And so the fellow on the left these are suggested national costumes to parade before the Prince. The Englishman on the left is dressed as a sailor. The fellow on the right is obviously Scottish with his bagpipes and his kilt. And the fellow in the middle is an Irishman wearing breeches and stockings and brandishing a bottle of liquor. And in one sketch, Abbott wrote, he had Paddy and Michael talking, and Paddy says to Michael, "You know, Michael," actually, I'll read it so I don't muck it up. "You know, Michael, if you put your money in today in the bank, you can get it out tomorrow by giving a fortnight's notice." So you can see how the Irish were parodied. So even though the Irish and the Chinese were lampooned, Abbott, according to the beliefs at the time, very clearly made a statement that the Irish were superior to the Chinese because they were white. And so this cartoon in the background, you've got two Irishmen absolutely agog at the fact that a Chinaman is having his boots polished by a white man. So make no mistake, the Irish weren't much chop in the eyes of the British, but they were better than the Chinese. So I just need to get my notes again. Okay, so the Ballarat Punch had a lot to say about mining, and the January 1868 cover is more representative of big business mining. So over the course of the 1850s and 1860s, alluvial gold ran dry and they started going deeper and deeper and deeper into the ground. And they needed finance and capital. And so lots of big businesses invested in big mining. And I live in Golden Point, so I'm still, and some of my friends are here who live in Golden Point, and we're still hearing the explosions going on a regular basis underground. But then they had to hire labour. So as people began to, the alluvial gold dried up, people began to need to get work. So they ended up coming from Britain because they wanted a different kind of life, and ended up going back and working for the man in horrendous conditions. And the Ballarat Punch says a lot about the horrendous working conditions of miners and the corruption of big business mining and the local politicians' corruption involved in that as well. So what we have here is more paraphernalia of big business mining with the poppet head and the mining trolleys. But we also have Joey, and Joey has replaced Toby. Now, Toby was Mr. Punch's pet in the theatre productions, the street productions from the 1600s. And he also became a little mascot alongside with Mr. Punch in the London Punch. And the Melbourne Punch continued to use Toby, but Abbott replaced him with Joey. So he was saying something about the colonial identity, the emerging colonial identity. And he produced a full-page sketch talking about Toby's tumble down a mine shaft and how Joey was being brought in to replace him. So again, messages. Britain out, Australia in. This is a sketch that was produced in the Illustrated Australian News in July 1868, and I'm sure everyone can recognise where it was sketched. It's a beautiful sketch, and you feel like you're back there. So I don't think much has changed really, except Minerva's now on the Mechanics Institute and a bit more forward. But I think it was the London Chartered Bank of Australia is now the Commonwealth Bank. But other than that, there's really not much change, is there? Isn't it wonderful? Okay. Abbott talked a lot about the abuse of miners, and this sketch talks about the fact that the St George's mine tried to reduce mining truckers' wages from £2, 5 shillings a week to £2. And they were protesting peacefully. They downed tools and had a peaceful protest, but it turned ugly when the mining company decided to bring in other labour. And so Abbott has drawn this young Ballarat. In a lot of the punches around various parts of the British Empire, they would use young Ballarat or young Canada to epitomise the youthfulness of the community. But he's taking a very firm stance, and he has a flag that said, "No surrender, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves." Toward the end of the Ballarat Punch's run, gold started to dry up. They found more eventually, but there was a dry up of gold toward the late 1860s. So Abbott made much of the fact that it was sending men mad and broke. So this cartoon here, it's Jake and Rox dressed in tatters, and Rox is still trying to sell mining shares on the pavement, and Jake says, "Rox, can you do anything in benevolent asylums?" And Rox says, "No, Jake, I've got a promoter's interest in the Ararat Lunatic Asylum if that's of any use to you." So very clear message there. I'm going to pause on the slides for a bit, and I'm very mindful of the time. I've still got a lot to get through, so I might, if you give me another 15. Okay. Abbott was, even though he advocated for miners and miners' rights, he was very much middle class. He was very much a white middle class British male, and he saw his type as superior. And this is an example of this. In one article, he was admonishing the wealthier in town for not patronising the traditional theatre. And he said, "Who dares sneer at Tom, Dick and Harry for plunging into the vile debauchery of an Easter fair when those who should direct and control popular taste tacitly encourage, by their apathetic indifference, such low excesses? If there is any fault, it rests with those who presume to a superior position, from whose example the lower classes are supposed to profit." Okay, that's pretty clear. However, he also infused his punch with a sense of fairness, and he advocated for the poor in East Ballarat, and he also advocated for the appalling working conditions of many low-paid staff. So this is a poem titled "The Song of the Shift," and I'll read it out to you. It's about miners. "The scriptures may well teach, keep holy the Sabbath day, and well-kept parsons still may preach and point out heaven's way. But to slaves, slaves, slaves in the bowels of the earth, with a wall of adamant between, their preaching's little worth. And who were the slavish hounds that hold human souls so cheap, who care not a straw if they get but gold, what a harvest the fiend may reap, who having no souls themselves, like vampires suck life's blood, from the soaring toilers toiling along midst their dirt and filth and mud." This was actually a take on a very famous poem written by Englishman Thomas Hood called "The Song of the Shirt," which was about the exploitation of British seamstresses in the 1840s. And that was published in the London Punch, and it caused an absolute furor at the time. But the London Times picked it up and published it and attributed it to Punch. And then Punch became then known as the little magazine with a big heart. And I think probably Abbott's publication might have been seen in that vein too sometimes. Here's another fake letter from Abbott about from a servant girl who says, "On the day that my master gave a commendable public speech endorsing the 8-hour working day, I was up before 6 a.m, and it was past midnight before I got to bed. And I find I had been working hard all the time. I know we are only sneered at and ridiculed because we are ignorant, but Mr. Punch, we have no opportunity of being otherwise. It is work, work, work for 18 hours out of 24. So if we're a little silly, it's not much to be wondered at. Are we poor servant girls to have no share in the 8 hours movement? And if not, why not?" Some of you might know that the stonemasons in Melbourne were the first to receive an 8-hour day in 1856, so it was a big topic at the time. And I'm going to speed it up a little bit because I am running out of time. So Abbott was probably too unwell to continue by the time that the Ballarat Punch ceased publication. He had 14 hospital admissions between 1871 and when he died in 1886. But he did try and resurrect another satirical publication in 1871 with F.W. Niven, and it was called The Wee Wee. And the Ballarat Star was quick to point out in a subsequent notice that the wee wee was an instrument of the chase when hunting grouse. It was nothing else. So it caused a bit of a giggle, apparently. But it was produced for 5 weeks to great acclaim. And then 5 weeks later, Abbott was admitted to hospital. That was his first admission, and it lasted for 5 months. There's then more newspaper articles about 1877. There was an intention for Abbott to resurrect the Ballarat Punch, and that also caused quite a bit of excitement in Melbourne, in Ballarat, and further afield in regional areas. But a couple of weeks later, he was admitted again to hospital, and he had a further 10 admissions until he passed away. So clearly his ill health thwarted him from earning a decent living. Now I'm going to quickly whiz through. I'll let you read that. This was the Ballarat Star article just notifying people that the Ballarat Punch was no more, and they were very sad about it. Everyone read it? Abbott also produced a number of watercolours. This one's called The Interior of Bushman's Hut. And I'm fairly certain this is a self-portrait, because if you look at the interior of this bushman's hut, he's pretty cultured. He has a piano, he has literature, and he also has a book next to him called On Female Emigration. So I'd like to think that that's Abbott. We don't know, but I'd like to think so. He also produced 2 watercolours, one of which depicts the names of some of the soldiers that were killed at the Eureka stockade. He painted some of the tombstones, and that's the only source of names we have. So that's a very valuable source. That's at the old Gold Museum. What was the Gold Museum? Now, when I was researching, before I had the medical records, I didn't have a date of birth, so I went to his grave. And I found his gravesite, and there was nothing there, even though when he was buried, he died a pauper, and he refused to allow his friends to petition his wealthy family overseas for money. He was quite a proud man, and so he died with nothing. And his friends whipped around town. He was quite well known and quite popular, according to the obituaries, and they put enough money together to give him something better than a pauper's burial. And so when I went to find his grave, whatever had been built there at the time was no longer there. So I thought that wasn't fitting for a man who'd made the town laugh for so long, and who had left such an important historical record, both with paintings and his punch. And so I did something about that. So I paid for a plaque. And just very quickly, I have 2 minutes left on the clock. I managed to locate some of his living relatives in England. They are the direct descendants of his brother Theodosius, because I can keep going? Okay. They're the direct descendants of his brother Theodosius. So he has I found a great-grandnephew, Geoffrey Datson, and a great-great-grandnephew, his son Paul. And Geoffrey Datson was in local council in Cambridge, and he was a writer. And at the time I made contact with him in 2022, he was researching about his ancestor, Lord Tenterton, and he was writing a book, which he has published now, about Lord Tenterton, and I got cited in it, which was really cool. So we made contact. They had lost complete track of Charles Abbott after 1851. He disappeared from the census, obviously, because he'd come to Australia. They had no idea about him or his publication. So I gave them all the information I had, and they gave me some lovely, useful information as well. And Geoffrey's son, Paul, was supposed to come here this month because he's a mad rugby fan, and he was going to Brisbane to watch the Lions play, but the silly sod decided to get married instead. So he's coming, I think, next year or the year after. But he'll be coming to Ballarat, so I'll take him around Ballarat, and I'll be calling upon some of the institutions like the Eureka Centre and other places to show him a very warm Ballarat welcome and make a bit of a fuss of him when he does turn up. And that's it. Thank you for listening.